Hey there, Hackers here. In this video, we're going to go over a couple of different versions of a shell script that I wrote, where the first version is basically a brute force attempt at solving the problem, which it did, and the second version is a refactored version that's a little bit more flexible, a lot less convoluted, and a little bit more robust, basically a better solution in my opinion. And I do think, though, there is a third version out there that could exist, and I figured it would be fun to make a video where maybe you can comment below on how to improve the second version to make it even better, because it does have one problem in the end, although it is one of those problems where it just isn't going to apply for the use case. But, who knows? I like to make things more robust when I can. And some of this stuff is going to be open source, so it's not all private work or anything like that. But yeah, let's first go over the use case of the script itself and, kind of what we're going to be covering in this video. So the script itself is pretty small. It's like a 15-line script that's a wrapper script for something else. And before we start looking at that code, yeah, so the use case here is I was doing some client work, and we have a CI pipeline set up in Bitbucket. And, this could be also on GitHub or GitLab. It doesn't really matter where you're running your CI. But we have these 8 different services running this type of thing in a pipeline, although now it's been replaced with the wrapper script as of last week. But yeah, so there's one program here on the left that runs. It's got all sorts of different command line flags that you can run. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this real left command. Right now, I'm just using echo as a placeholder here. Once you start looking at the wrapper script, though, and this left-hand side script, I'm actually going to be open sourcing later. But yeah, it's got a couple of different flags, like imagine, let's say 2 or 3 different flags that all the pipelines are going to want that set. But there are a couple of different positional arguments or command line flags that each pipeline might want to set, but they're not all the same. And then the command on the right is basically, the output of this command on the left gets piped into it, and then it goes and does some, private things that aren't important at all. But when you run this in a pipeline, at least on Bitbucket by default, Bitbucket's shell environment doesn't have pipe fail set, that option that you can set at the top of your shell if you're running bash. So what happens here is, like, if this left-hand side command ever fails, then by default, then the right-hand command will actually execute, which is not what I wanted. So there are ways to get around that. For example, you can do bash C here, and you can run your command like this. And then you could do, set your options here for pipe fail, and then, run your command over here. And something like this would work. I know the quotes are misaligned, whatever, but this is basically the idea. But this would be kind of nasty to have to put in 8 different pipeline files. It just feels like, right, it's a little bit convoluted. It's a little bit too much boilerplate. Like, you're exposing the internal details of something that could potentially be improved upon. So that's where this wrapper script comes into play. So the wrapper script is just going to be pretty small shell script, whatever, 15, 20 lines of code. And it is going to handle setting those default flags for that first piped command there that we saw, and also allow you to pass in input to it at the individual pipeline level. And then the pipeline file itself, only needs to basically call the wrapper script with, maybe some custom arguments, maybe not, and it's going to be super nice. And it's also a little bit nicer too, because this wrapper script actually exists in like a base Docker image that gets run. So I don't know, all the logic for that is going to be in one spot. It doesn't need to be duplicated across like 8 different pipelines in case that pipeline itself happens to change in the wrapper script itself. So a little bit hard to follow maybe, but will make a little bit more sense once we start looking at some code. But before we even look at the code, let me run the first version of the wrapper script here. They both do identical things, by the way, at the point they are right now in the code. But yeah, let's understand how the script even works, see its outputs, and then once we know the inputs and the outputs, then we'll look at the code. And I promise it's not a lot of code. So yeah, so the first way you can run this script is you can just run it like this with no arguments. And right now the wrapper script literally is just echoing things out instead of really running the true commands, because they don't need to run the commands for the sake of this video. We just want to see how it works. Like, these are the arguments that it would pass into the other command. Actually, let me open up the bottom of this one just so we can look at that really quickly. Right, it's literally just echoing, potentially the Dockerfile path, some other arguments, and a couple of common flags that we want set across the board. Right, these are what these are. And, these flags and the context used in Docker and stuff is specific to what that first echo command did in the pipeline. So it's going to be a script that helps you keep your Docker files up to date. I will be open sourcing that at some point in time, but that's been running now in production for some client work for quite some time now, a couple of months. It's working well, but this wrapper script is something that I put together, I don't know, last week or so, and figured now would be a cool time to make a video about it. But anyways, that's the super basics of how this thing works in the most base case where, you're not passing in any arguments. But you may want to pass in the path to the Docker file. In this case, it could literally just be Docker file. You'll get the same output here. But, some of the pipeline files have their Docker file in a different directory. Like we do have a Docker file in our repo to build a base CI image. And in that case, well, that repo has other things in it besides that. So our Docker file is in a CI directory here. So we can see now we are able to pass in a custom Docker file path, which gets output over here. If you have a Docker file named something else, then we want to be able to customize that maybe, right? In our case, we always use Docker file as the name of a Docker file. We have one Docker file for all environments. I think that's a good idea. But yeah, whatever. You may have a different custom name for your Docker file. It supports that. So besides that, you may want to also pass in some other flags potentially too. And these will all get passed along to that, script that's going to run in the wrapper script over here. And you might have multiple flags that you want to pass in too. The names of these flags are not important. Bump minor in this case, if it's a Docker updating script, it will bump up something like a Python 3.10.1 to 3.11.3. Like, it'll give you the most latest version, bumping up the minor version from, .10 to .11, but not all of our base images support that idea. Like some of them just don't have that idea of a minor version, so we don't need to bump it. So, that wouldn't be set for those because, maybe you're not just working with Python, you have like PHP and Node and Ruby and all sorts of other different languages as well. So that is some of the use cases here of calling this. You can also call this in a way where, maybe you do want to pass in some custom flags, but you don't want to pass in a custom Docker file. So when you run this command like this, or, with one flag as well, then the idea there is, it's just going to default us to the Docker file here, which is, the expected value, right? 99% of the time we would want Docker file being set. So let's default to that, even if we don't pass it in explicitly. So there's all the different inputs and all the different outputs here, right? We can see, no arguments, passing the file, maybe a custom file, a couple of flags, maybe, just the flags with no file name. Done. Now let's look at the first version of this code here. And fair warning, this is like, the brute force solution of it. And I don't know about you, but, and by the way, some of the stuff up here, I've done videos about this in the past. I'll leave a card up for what these do, but you can see pipe fail being set there. But yeah, usually if I'm going to be working on a programming problem, I am very much, I guess you can say, an exploratory developer. I like to open up a terminal or my code editor and just start working on things and like incrementally do some work, see some output, do some work, see some output. And I kind of sort of learn about the problem scope as I'm doing the work. And in a lot of cases, that works quite well. It's not a problem. But in some cases, and this is one of those cases, and I guess really it's often the case, I guess, but like if you find yourself struggling to understand or come up with the logic to solve the problem that you're trying to define, then maybe you don't have a good enough understanding of the entire problem set going on. So like when that type of things happen, like, this is like a rat's nest of if conditions, and we're going to break it down here before we go into the improved version. But it's like, this just, I didn't just write that in 5 minutes, rattling that out. What I ended up doing was actually this exercise here. Like, I wanted to live in a world like of wishful thinking. Like, let's say the script works completely fine. What are the actual inputs to this thing? Like, how can we actually call it? What do we want to support? And once I had this defined, like the actual scope of the problem that I wanted to solve, then I started writing this over here. And like, normally I wouldn't make a video about this, but like, oftentimes like what you see in a video is the end result, pristine, like super nice refactored version of something, and you don't see the pain that it may have took to get there. This is a little bit of the pain that took to get there. This is a very like incremental, like imperative, like literally, every if condition into it's super convoluted. It's actually probably going to be even hard to understand to even comment on this in the video, even though I wrote it like a week ago. That's why I also added so many comments here. Like these comments are actually commit in the code because I feel like if these comments weren't here, someone would look at that and be like, is this guy on drugs? Like what's going on over here? But yeah, okay. So let's go into some of this code here and just see how it works. Okay, so we got a couple of different variables up here, right? We need to default to a Docker file if there's no path being passed in. And we've got another variable here. And by the way, both of these scripts, they do pass shell check. So if I do shell check on wrapper 1, it works. Wrapper 2 also works, which we'll see in a bit, wrapper 2. But yeah, the first argument being passed in is the path, right? So we saw that over here, potentially, right? Could be empty. So what I do here is make sure to check to see if that Docker file path actually exists. And by the way, this check isn't necessary from like this script's perspective. the real script being called down here, not echo, it does check to make sure the file actually exists before doing anything. So this is like an extra, like, I don't know, it was like the strategy I chose to differentiate, are we dealing with a Dockerfile path or something like a flag? So we check to see, okay, does the path actually exist? Okay, it does. Then all of this down here is not going to execute because, we're in the true condition of the if condition. All we're going to do here is just shift. Now, I've also done videos in the past around dealing with or parsing command line arguments and positional arguments and flags and things with shell scripts. I'll leave a card up for that one. The TLDR shift is, I guess we can spend 1 minute here on just putting something like this so we can see the output. I'll put some dots just so we can see. But if I run this with fail like that, we can see that, the @ symbol there, it's all the arguments being passed into the script. So a little bit better if I put it in the Docker file as well, a little bit easier to follow. We can see we have Docker file and then fail and then our dots from the echo. And when we shift, we're going to shift the first element out of this list. So we're basically getting rid of the Docker file, and now $@ is just going to have fail in it. And in fact, before we go into even further in the script, down here, this other args, and there's a $@ after it's been shifted potentially with all these conditions up here, we just pass those in as all the arguments to the script over here. But that Dockerfile path ends up being passed in as the first one. So we end up with like Dockerfile and then all the other arguments. So that's basically how like the TLDR and how that works there. So the file does exist. We know that's the Dockerfile path. So we can safely define that as being it, because like $1 in this case would be like literally you passing that in there. Okay, so now let's go into the else condition here when, I don't know, we're not really sure what it is yet. So all we know is that the Dockerfile path didn't exist, which could be, it being empty potentially, or possibly a flag. So now we say, okay, well, let's do a regular expression check here. And by the way, you will need bash 4 or above. So if you're running macOS, you'll want to brew install bash, probably a good idea anyways, because that's running an ancient version of bash from like a million years ago. So we do a regex here, right? If the input starts with a dash followed by one or more characters, so it could be --fail or -f or basically any flag that you want, then that is probably going to be, well, it is going to be a flag that you passed in, right? So we know a custom Dockerfile path wasn't used in that case because we know that it's going to be a flag in that case. So let's just use the default value of the Dockerfile path, which in this case would be Dockerfile. And even now it's like I'm struggling to even comment on this part without those comments. But yeah, in the other condition where this regex fails, when we know that it's not a path, or sorry, not a flag, then we do a check to make sure if there's any arguments being passed into the script at all. Because if we call the script with no arguments, then, we want to default to the Dockerfile. We saw that before, right? When we run it like this with no arguments at all. So, we know in that case, the Docker path doesn't exist, so else condition fires. But yeah, in this case, this is going to fail. It's going to be the else condition. We know that the arguments are equal to 0 in this case. So yeah, now the Dockerfile path, let's default to the Dockerfile. And that's how we end up with Dockerfile down here being set. Otherwise, we shift it out because we know that it was an actual flag. We know we're actually using a custom Dockerfile there. So yeah, anyways, like we just shift it in the end. So we end up with using the custom Dockerfile value there, which would be Dockerfile 2 or whatever you want. And, that basically gives us the end result that we want. And it almost doesn't matter that I explain this horribly because, yeah, I don't know, this is super convoluted, right? The whole reason I'm making this video is to show the improved version and then also maybe even improve it together to make something even better. Or at least handle some of the edge cases that we're going to see in the second one. So that is the first version in all its glory. Spoiler alerts, if you want to comment below on, what you could do to even make this version more clear before we look at the second one, feel free to let us know. Maybe drop in like, hey, V1 could be improved. Let's call this one V1. The other one is going to be V2. So yeah, let's take a look here at V2. And I guess technically before we even look at it, in a semi-related note is if you're going to be refactoring some code, make sure that your test case passes. Like I don't have automated tests here, but yeah, well, in this case, it's already pre-written, but maybe you get the idea. I don't even know if I get the idea, but we can see here, passing in a Dockerfile, we can also pass in something like a custom path there if you want, like whatever it happens to be, right? So let's go back to just Dockerfile here. We can pop in our fail flag like that. With one flag, we can see, there's a Dockerfile with the fail. We can also put in bump minor. The order of these don't matter. They can be anything. The idea there, though, is we want to make sure it supports multiple, not just one. So there's that. And now let's see how we go when we are going to put no Dockerfile at all, right? So same thing. Cool. and then we can see it defaults to Dockerfile in both of them, and it passes through all the flags like they did before. Now, there is one nice benefit of this one as well, in that you can put Dockerfile anywhere in the ordering here. It's going to work. Even if it's shoved in the middle of two different flags, it will make sure that Dockerfile comes first when the script on the bottom is called here. I know this is the first one. We're going to look at the second one now. But yeah, we're in good shape here, right? The second version of this script is working in the same way as the first one, except it also has the added benefit of being a little bit more flexible. Cool. So let's look at the second one. And the second one is less code, less comments. And I will say that some of these comments here, honestly, I'm sort of just writing them for the sake of the video, just so that everyone can see them. They're not commit to the code like with this, because this is like extremely descriptive. Like the code does literally what the comment says. And kind of don't like writing comments like that, but it's good to have it here because, if you want to check the blog post later, which will be linked in the description, well, this code is going to be there if you want to run that. So yeah, let's take a look here and peel this one back a little bit. So it starts off basically the same idea. We've got this idea of a default Dockerfile path, and we have a variable to contain that path. Other args made its way over here. I put it at the top of the file because the idea here is, let's define it and then maybe append to it if we need to later, and then we'll reference it down here. I should say like this file down here, or sorry, this line down here is exactly the same as the first one. We can see down here exactly the same, no difference on those. But there are differences for all this. So let's go over this a bit. And in that video that I made before around parsing command line flags, it goes over this approach of having a while loop and then doing a case statement and then picking apart to see if something is a flag or a positional argument. And then eventually you get to the end where all the arguments are parsed and you can do whatever you want. So that video goes into way more detail about the loops and things. We're going to do like a flyby version of that one. You can always look at the details later in the previous video. But yeah, this all starts with just looping to make sure that the number of, or looping when we have arguments that are greater than 0. So basically, if you're passing in any arguments, then this case condition is going to run, and this loop is going to continue running while we have at least one argument, and we're shifting on each iteration of the loop for all the cases here to make sure that we eventually do end up in a scenario where we have no arguments left, there's no more work to do, and the rest of the script completes. But let's go over the most basic case here, where we're not even dealing with the while loop, right? This would be the case where we run wrapper2 like this with no arguments at all. So, the count is already 0, so it's not greater than 0, so the while loop never happens. So then just this line over here executes, minus all the stuff up here. And this one says, look, if the Dockerfile path is empty, meaning this value is empty, which it is by default, right? This is the default path, but literally the actual Dockerfile path that we're going to pass through, empty by default. So going to be empty at this case. So then what do we do? Well, let's just define it as the default path, right? So if it's empty, boom, it just hits the Dockerfile default path there. And if we change this one to be, Docker 123, then we're going to get 123 there because that's the default value being set. In my mind, like this logic, crystal clear. Right? It does require some context of bash to know that we're checking to see if this variable is unset or undefined. That -n is the other, like flipped version of that one, like if there is something there. In that case, this would be empty because this condition won't fire and then things aren't going to be output, right? But we don't want that. We want the empty version because if it is, then we populate it. Boom, done. Pretty straightforward in my opinion. Then let's take a look here at the while loop. So we've got some arguments being passed in, right? Could be a Dockerfile, could be a flag, could be some combination of both in any orders. So then we need to start parsing those arguments and understanding what they are. So we have a case statement on $1. $1 in this case is going to be the first argument passed in. So for example, if we had 2 here, first argument is Dockerfile, the next one is going to be fail. So we need to do a check here to see what is this thing. So we're still doing a very similar strategy where we're checking to see is it a flag or not? And this is one of the problems in general, which I guess we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, if this argument starts with a dash followed by any character, this is not a regular expression here. I don't think Bash supports that. At least I didn't find that it did from Googling around very quickly, but it does support the idea of, you can use like a star here to match anything. So, if it starts with any flag, then we just take this other args array that we have, and this is Bash syntax here to append to the array. So we're saying, all right, take other args and just append this flag to it, right? So we know we have a flag like fail or bump minor or whatever flags that we happen to be, and then we shift, and then we move on to the next iteration of the loop, and eventually we'll hit 0. But okay, so that handles all the flags. Great. Now let's say that it's not a flag, right? It's literally anything else. Then in this case, this is the file path being set. Although, like, it's possible that there is nothing there, right? So that handles the case of, let me also make this a little bit, there we go, in case I'm getting cut off in the bottom there, if you have like captions on or something. But yeah, you can have this, right? Like where you just have the flag, but there's no Docker file. So in this case, you have one flag, next loop happens, and it matches this, but like now Docker file path is empty. So we need to handle that here. And we already did with a 0 argument case, right? So if it's empty, then boom, it gets set there. So I feel like this is a lot clearer, like, I don't know, night and day difference, but it's also one of those things where like when you write the code, you sort of understand it because you wrote it. Like, let me know in the comments below, first of all, is this version clearer, like better or worse? I don't know. I wear glasses. If you've ever been to an optometrist, yeah, they cover one eye and then they make you say like better or worse. And then they kind of do like a bisection search to find the prescription lens that you want. Like you may need to do yes, no, better, worse type of thing 10 times to find the exact prescription that you want. Interesting side topic potentially. But yeah, so that is the working solution here for version 2. Again, like this is the version that I shipped, but it does have the problem in the sense that there is no way at the moment for this script to know, oh, by the way, the first script did a file check right over here. This is not like an accidental regression here by not checking that somewhere, because again, that first script that really gets called down here, that script is responsible for checking if that file exists or not. It doesn't need to be in the wrapper script. And again, pipefail is going to protect us because pipefail will say like, again, this is going to be piped into something else that we don't see here. But yeah, if this pipe fails because that file doesn't exist, then everything stops and we're good. So that logic only needs to be in one spot, not two. So that wasn't an accidental regression. But the problem here is it doesn't really know, right, how to differentiate this from a flag. Is this a flag or is this a custom Docker file? Do you have a Docker file literally named -Docker file? Well, this logic thinks that no, you don't, and it's an actual flag. So we end up with like the default of Docker file with your custom flag of Docker file, even though this may actually be the name of your Docker file. Now, in my opinion, it would be a little bit weird to have a file name for Docker that starts with a dash. Technically possible, never in a million years going to apply to my projects here. And this wrapper script wouldn't be open source anyways, because like the second thing this thing pipes to is very specific to that company. But yeah, I don't know. It's still, there's like something in my brain that says like, you should maybe handle that to be correct, like more robust, but I don't know. I figured it wasn't worth the time to take this any further, but it is a good time to make a video to learn together, right? How can we actually improve that? And, just to be also more clear, you could theoretically have, I don't know, a Docker file named my file, right? And again, it's going to think it's a flag. So what do we do? Now, there are some options maybe around like checking to see if this exists as a file or something. I don't know. And if it does exist, then we know that it's a file. If not, then it's a flag. But is that worth it? Is that even going to be a 100% solution? I actually didn't think that through fully. I don't know. I'm sort of just rambling here. But yeah, if you have any improvements to this one, and also, by the way, like, why I made this video too is, in my mind, like this is a much better version than the first version, but there could be another version of this, like a third version of it, where it's like a monumental shift in thinking in how to solve this in a completely different way that maybe I'm just not aware of, Like right now, I'm pretty deep in the forest itself, like with a magnifying glass, looking at a piece of moss from like 2 inches away, but someone else may look at this from like, zoomed out 1,000 feet at the whole forest and be like, yo, you just do this, this, this instead, and like all of this goes away and now you have it done. So I don't know, maybe that solution exists, and I figured that'd be an interesting topic for a video. So in that case, yeah, whatever, if there's any improvement that you think that could be done here, let us know in the comments below. Also, if you like this type of video, leave a like, really does help a lot. If you have any questions about any of this, I'll do all my best, or I will do my best to answer all those questions. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.